All right, so I'm really excited to announce tonight's talk. We have, for tonight's Science Pub, I'm very excited to introduce Nicole Keleher, Department of Conservation and Research Forest Health Director for Massachusetts. And we're going to be hearing about southern pine beetle and Massachusetts forests. So with that, thank you, Nicole, for being here tonight.
Yeah, thanks for asking me to join. I love getting to talk about bugs and everything my team works on. I will say that, unfortunately, sometimes the things I talk about do sound a little bit negative, can sound a little bit scary, but it is important to share information with the public and get the word out there about these bigger concerns going on. So southern pine beetle is one of the biggest threats we kind of are concerned about, and my team is working hard on detecting and monitoring it here in Massachusetts. So just a little background on myself and my team. So the Forest Health Program is part of the DCR's Bureau of Forestry, and we focus statewide on all sorts of projects identifying threats to our forests and monitoring, surveying, mapping, doing long-term monitoring plots, and then also when we can, identifying areas where we can do mitigation options. So things such as treatment programs, silvicultural applications, or biocontrol releases. And we have all sorts of, I know we're a small state here in Massachusetts, but the difference from you guys out on Nantucket and the islands to the Berkshires, our forests are really diverse. We have a lot of different tree species, and we have a lot of different pests and diseases that go along with those. So unfortunately, we don't get out to the islands very often. We get to Nantucket one time a year. But if you're ever out on the mainland on any of our DCR parks, forests, we also aren't limited to political boundaries. So we work with our other state partners and landowners, and we do tons of different projects out there. So if you ever see us out in the forest with weird contraptions or looking with binoculars or microscopes at trees and bugs, always feel free to ask us questions. We love to talk. And I have a fairly small team. There's 4 full-time staff, and we have 2 seasonals. So we cover a huge amount of area with a small team, but we're able to get a lot of work done because we have some really great partners that have been able to help us, such as out on Nantucket. Danielle from NCF has helped us a ton with southern pine beetle trapping. Organizations like Mass Audubon, the trustees, communities that have town forests and town parks that allow us to use their properties for some of our trapping and monitoring programs have allowed us to be as successful and thorough as we can be as we do some of this work across the state. And one of the big tools we use every year is an aerial survey. So we get into a tiny little Cessna, myself and one other forester with a pilot, and we map everything weird we see in our trees from the air. And it kind of gives us a good snapshot, big picture of what's going on across the state, what's wrong in our forests every year. From the damage we map, we actually go out on the ground and ground truth and actually make sure and confirm, like, yep, this is definitely defoliation caused by spongy moth, or no, this was definitely white pines instead. So we go through and we're really thorough through this process. We've been flying like this consistently since 1967, and from 1939 to 1967 we had a partial data set for those years. So it's a long-term project, and it really helps us identify what's going on in our forests. And this map is really small, really hard to see, but if it's something that you're interested in checking out, I would suggest taking a look at our Forest Health Story Map. So you can save that link, use the QR code, or if you forget, and just Google DCR Forest Health Story Map, it'll come up. And as part of our story map, we have an interactive map for our aerial survey. So you can zoom in to your area, click on it, see what actually, like, the areas that were impacted, what was causing that damage. And we have a lot of other really cool information about the projects we're doing, common pests and diseases in the forest, and how you can identify them. And in our Forest Health Story Map, we keep 2 years of data. So we have 2021 and 2022 up there right now, but all of our historic data can actually be found as part of this regional database. So the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative hosts all New England and New York's aerial survey historic data. So they currently have our data from 1939 to 2020 on their data set. So you can filter by location, state, type of damage, year range. So it's really cool to take a look and kind of see historically what's been happening in our states and in our forests. So all the different projects we work on, one of the ones that has been kind of keeping me up at night, and the thing I'm kind of most concerned about going into this field season is southern pine beetle. So southern pine beetle is a bark beetle. So they are actually super, super tiny. You'll see in the picture, it's compared to a grain of rice, the one on the left. The beetle on the right is black turpentine beetle, which is a native beetle that's in the same genus as southern pine beetle. The big difference besides the size of them is black turpentine are usually attracted to declining, really stressed out trees, where southern pine beetle can and will attack healthy trees as well. So how does something so small cause so much damage and has so much concern? It really comes down to numbers. So southern pine beetle will attack trees, thousands of beetles attacking a single tree until it can overcome a tree's defenses. So even though it is these tiny, tiny, cute little beetles, they can do a ton of damage. So they are native to the southern United States, where they've historically been somewhat problematic. So it is a pest that will go through outbreaks, cause significant damage in their forest. It is a challenge for timber stands down there that are things like yellow pines, where they're trying to grow for timber production, and having a southern pine beetle causes a lot of economic impact for them. So it's a tiny beetle. They live just under the bark on a tree. So they feed just under the bark. They'll make their galleries. The adult beetle will bore through the bark of a tree, enter a tree, create a gallery where they'll do some feeding, and they'll create these chambers where they'll lay an egg. That egg will then develop as a larvae in that chamber, feed itself. And then once it's an adult and mature, it'll emerge. When it is early spring, the beetles that emerge will sometimes fly and disperse really far. It is also during that time that they can attract to a tree and start aggregating. But usually during the rest of the summer, they'll stay within the tree, either the tree they were born or an adjacent tree. It has about 8 generations down in the South. So down in Georgia, where it can be really problematic, they'll see up to 8 generations through the course of the growing season. Up here in the North, we see about 2 to 3 generations. So those warmer temperatures, warmer winters, longer growing seasons allow a lot of generations, a lot of beetles to reproduce really quickly and cause a huge amount of damage. And as the name implies, in southern pine beetle, they attack pine trees. So they have a fairly broad host of trees that they can attack and can complete their life cycle in, but they have some that they really prefer. And the one up here in the Northeast that they really prefer is pitch pine. So here in Massachusetts, most of our pitch pine is in coastal areas. So out on Nantucket and the other islands, you see a ton of pitch pine throughout Cape Cod, through even Plymouth, most of Plymouth and Bristol County. We see a lot of coastal pitch pine, but we do also see other ones, like the picture that's on the left is from the top of Mount Everett, which is down in southern Berkshire County. So sometimes we see it in these high elevation areas. Sometimes we have pockets of really dense pine habitat in little pockets in central Massachusetts. One of the biggest ones is in Montague Plains, which is in Franklin County. So the majority of it is found out in our coastal areas, but pitch pine and this unique pitch pine habitat can be found throughout our state in these areas. And so all of these unique forest habitats are at risk for southern pine beetle. And historically, it hadn't been an issue up here in New England. So even though we have a potential host, we haven't had issues with southern pine beetle. But as temperatures have been warming, as we're feeling the impacts of climate changes, so we're having warmer winters, we're having hotter summers, we're having earlier springs, later falls, and it just kind of allows this pest to slowly creep further and further north. So by the late 90s, early 2000s, it started becoming a problem in New Jersey, where historically it had not been. And then in 2014, they had a significant outbreak in Long Island that caused huge amounts of pitch pine loss. Hundreds of acres of trees were lost in 2014, and New York's been battling outbreaks of southern pine beetle on and off since then. So here in New England, we're just a little bit colder, a little bit further north than Long Island, but we have a really similar climate. We have really similar forest types. And as our climate keeps changing, we're more and more at risk of southern pine beetle causing a significant impact here. So just because it's in a place, you kind of builds up to these outbreak levels, and it can be really rapid that this kind of happens, and it's pretty easy to identify when you do have an infestation. So when you have these thousands of individual beetles attacking a tree, it causes a lot of damage really quickly. So you'll have a tree that at the beginning of the spring will look fine, nice green canopy. By the middle to end of the summer, you'll start to see the canopy totally turning red or brown, and you'll start to see some of these other signs of infestation. One of the biggest ones is the picture on the right, which are the pitch tubes. So as a beetle tries to bore in under the bark, the tree does not want that. They don't want a beetle in there. They don't want to be infested. So they will push pitch out to try to push the beetles out. And you'll see in that lower picture that sometimes the beetles can't get through. They'll be trying to swim through that pitch. And if a tree is really healthy and vigorous, it will be able to fight off the attack at least somewhat. But it can get overwhelmed once you have these thousands of beetles that start attacking. So the pitch tubes, since the southern pine beetle is so small, the pitch doesn't really run out of these tubes just because it's this tiny little, like, it's the size of like when you put a push pin in a cork board. So it just looks like a glob of like popcorn, or someone just took like gum and stuck it all over the tree, because it'll dry right at the end of those pitch tubes. And when you see this kind of damage, if you peel back the bark and look underneath, you'll start to see those galleries that the adult make and those larval chambers. Sometimes you can find larvae, pupae under the bark there. And that's usually what you would try to look for to confirm that it's southern pine beetle. And you can kind of see the extent of this damage when you're looking for it. Another kind of cool sign is when you have a ton of bark beetles, you will suddenly have a ton of a bark beetle predator. So these are checkered beetles, and they are just like monsters. They will run up and down a tree, just ripping apart any southern pine beetle they can and just feeding on them. So when you have thousands of southern pine beetle attracted to a tree, you'll get hundreds of these checkered beetles attracted to those trees to feed on the southern pine beetle. So these guys will stay on the outside of the tree, but you'll see them running up and down the bark, trying to find beetles to feed on. And when we do our trapping collections, we actually count and look for checkered beetles as a sign that there could be a buildup in the bark beetle populations. So as you get an infested tree, it can move really, really rapidly. So one single infested tree can, over the course of a growing season, rapidly expand to become hundreds within a year or two. So you can kind of see some of these pictures are from New Jersey and some are from further south, where it'll rapidly move through these dense pine stands, causing significant mortality of trees as the population builds and continues to spread. And we do so bark beetles are incredibly diverse and common. We have all sorts of different bark beetle species that are native to our forests. We also have some that are introduced that don't really do much damage to our trees. So there is some lookalike damage that you might see out there caused by other bark beetle species. And the way we kind of can tell them apart is the type of damage we're seeing and where we're seeing it on the tree. So the furthest picture on the left is that black turpentine beetle from the earlier slide, where it is in the same genus but much bigger than the southern pine beetle. So its holes will always be bigger. Usually when the pitch tubes form on those, they'll run a little bit. Since the holes are bigger, it's pushing out a little bit more. And they're pretty much always on the very bottom of the tree. So they'll usually be from about 5 feet to up to the ground level. They only stay in that very lower section of the tree, and that's really common for our turpentine outbreaks. We also will commonly see like Ips beetles that'll go after declining and weakened trees. And Ips beetles, when they create their galleries, they have really distinctive shapes to them. Southern pine beetle always will usually really stick to the stem of the tree, the trunk. So they're usually from about 5 feet to 15 feet, which is a range that's like on your mid-sized pitch pine. But pitch pine can be so diverse in their sizing, because sometimes they'll grow like right in a sand dune, or sometimes they'll be in like a little bit inland of a forested area and be like a much bigger mature tree. Or sometimes they're on a mountaintop and they might be 100 years old, but still only 8 feet tall. But generally in your average size pitch pine that you'll see, most of the time they're in that 5 to 15 foot range is where you'll see southern pine beetle. You don't usually see a ton of damage like on branches or twigs. Those are usually other species of bark beetles. So this you can kind of see like there's tons of different bark beetles out there, but they're all really unique in how they utilize a tree, where we find them, the kind of patterns that they'll have under a bark. Most of the Ip ones have these really cool and very organized patterns to their galleries. Southern pine beetle are just like drunk drivers in the tree making crazy turns. And most of the time when we are seeing these other bark beetle species, it's when trees are really stressed out. So like the picture on the left, there was a controlled burn. It got a little too hot in some of the pockets and was really stressful to the pitch pines. It allowed turpentine beetles to come in. Or if we have really crazy storm events, like these late winter March storms can be really stressful sometimes on the wind, salt, temperature changes are kind of stressful on our coastal pines. And after an event like that, we can have some native bark beetles kind of come in on the stressed and weakened tree. So if you're seeing symptoms that don't fully align with where in the tree you'd see southern pine beetle, you know that there was another stressor event. It's commonly just these other bark beetles that we're seeing out there. But when you do have southern pine beetle and you are able to confirm it, you do want to take really quick action. So we are most effective in controlling it when we're able to find an infested tree early and able to take suppression action for it. So there aren't really like chemical or pesticide treatments that are very effective. Most of the time you do have to do tree removal to stop the spread of southern pine beetle through a stand. So when you have to go through your stand, identify the trees that you know are infested, and from there kind of decide what actions you want to take. And some of it depends on if it's close to a home or other structures, or if it's far out in a forested area, so have like no roads or trails, and kind of figuring out what's going to work for you. So it should say cut, not cute, but sometimes you can't pull the trees out, or there's not like a timber value for them. So you're going to cut your trees and leave them. So most of the time when they do that, you're going to drop the tree, chunk it up into smaller sections, run a saw down it to kind of open up the bark and allow moisture to get in there and kill any beetles that are in there. Sometimes you want to cut and remove. So like sometimes down south where it's like marketable timber, they want to still use that wood before it becomes too far gone, which can be kind of challenging. So a lot of bark beetles, southern pine beetle included, have funguses associated with them, and they have these like cute little pockets on their bodies where they will bring the fungus with them when they go to a new tree. And the fungus helps break down the wood a little bit, helps them be able to better feed on the tree, but it can cause staining and depreciate timber value. So that is why it's a challenge in the South and why they try to take really rapid action in some of their marketable stands. You can also cut and burn. So if you are in an area where it is easy, if you have the right weather conditions, you can cut the trees and then burn them to remove the stands. And a lot of times when you do a cut, you don't want to just cut your infested trees, but you do want to cut a little bit of a buffer, because there could be stands that are trees that are lightly infested that you weren't able to really tell, and kind of just make sure. So these pictures are from New York, where they had to do a significant amount of cutting on Long Island to address their southern pine beetle outbreaks. So you'll see, like, you have your dead trees, you have your trees that are actively infested, and then you have that buffer of assumed uninfested trees to kind of slow that down. Because when the southern pine beetles are aggregating, they're attracted to a few things. So they're attracted to, first, the pheromones that they themselves, the beetles, are putting out to attract other individuals from their species, but they also get attracted to the stress chemicals that the trees are releasing as they are infested. So they're just really good at sensing that, and being able to hone in and move to one area. They can fly like a quarter to a half a mile really easily to get to an infested tree, and aggregate with their fellow southern pine beetles. So for us here in Massachusetts, it's kind of the closest experience is what they had on Long Island. So they had mostly pitch pine stands, that had an outbreak that started in 2014. So we had some mild winters before that, and then they saw a huge amount of buildup and saw pockets of infested trees in multiple places through Long Island, in 2014. Since then, they've had a number of different pockets show up throughout the island. They currently have a pretty severe infestation in Brookhaven, that they're working on suppression actions this spring and summer and trying to address that. And they've seen a lot of success by doing some of these cutting efforts. So when they have gone in and being able to swiftly cut, and do a buffer cuts, do removal of infested trees, they've seen little spread and very minimal impact. So the picture on the bottom is kind of showing an area where they identified it in 2014. They were able to take immediate efforts and do suppression cuts. And within 2 years, there was very little spread, and minimal other trees infected. But the area shown in the picture on the top, between 2014, they weren't able to get in. I don't remember what their specific restrictions were at that site, but they were not able to take those suppression actions and do a cut. And it just grew a huge amount in 2 years. The population just kept growing and spreading. So being able to be effective at finding these populations and taking action, is really critical when dealing with southern pine beetle. And it can be hard to cut trees down, and it can be hard for the public sometimes to say, like, oh, we need to cut these trees to save a tree. But it is really necessary, and when we have a southern pine beetle outbreak, to save future trees and kind of minimize the impact of it. But the biggest thing about this is being proactive versus reactive. So being prepared can really reduce the long-term impact you're going to see to your forest. It's going to decrease the tree mortality. You see, decrease human hazards. So a lot of these forests we have homes mixed in and recreation areas mixed in. So when you have dead trees, that's a risk. That's a risk of them falling. It increases risk of fire and the severity of fire on our landscape. So it is important to kind of be prepared, so we can rapidly respond and take the swiftest action. So part of that is surveying, monitoring, but also efforts like outreach. So as I said before, my team is only 4 full-time staff. So we don't get out everywhere. I only get out to Nantucket once a year. So it's great to share our knowledge and information we have, and make more people aware of what southern pine beetle is, what the impact could be, and kind of what to look for. I love when people reach out, and share things with us. So if you ever see anything weird, feel free to take a picture, mark the location, and share it with us, because we can't be everywhere, and it is really valuable for everyone to kind of be a part of this community and taking care of our trees. So the biggest thing my team does to monitor southern pine beetles in the state is our trapping survey. So the picture on the right, you can see our trap hidden there hanging in a tree. We utilize these black funnel traps to look for southern pine beetles. So the traps have these lures on them. So it has frontalin, endobrevicommin, and alpha pinene. And these lures kind of mimic the chemicals that are released by the southern pine beetle and the tree when they are attacking and causing an outbreak. So it mimics those chemicals and will attract any southern pine beetle in the area to the trap. And we see if there's any nearby. So we first started these surveys in 2015 following the outbreak in Long Island to kind of see if we had them here in our forest, if we're at risk for these issues as well. And we did find them. We found them. We've caught southern pine beetle every year since we started, and they're present. They've been present in all sorts of stands. We found them in every county that we've trapped. We've found them in our beech stands, in our deeply forested stands, in our tiny trees, our big trees. So they're throughout our pitch pine, but we found them in really, really low numbers. So I would detect them in like maybe 2 sites a year, and I'd find like 1 or 2 beetles. The most before this year, the most we had ever found was like 8 beetles at a single site. So we had them present, had them low numbers. We weren't sure if they were just ones that kept kind of flying into Massachusetts, or if we had like low-level resident population. They're so tiny and small that if they get blown on a wind current, they can go for like dozens to hundreds of miles. So we weren't sure if we just kept getting beetles blown in from Long Island, but this last year we had a significant increase in our trap catch. So we had 24 sites last year, and we found southern pine beetle in 19 of them. So it was the most sites we'd ever caught in a single year, and we found more beetles than we've ever found before. So we had much higher numbers. Last year on Nantucket, all 3 sites that we surveyed at, we found southern pine beetle. We didn't find them in like super concerning numbers out on Nantucket. I think we had like 10, 15, and 20 beetles per site, which is an increase from what we had been seeing. But compared to areas like New York and New Jersey, when they have outbreaks or infested trees, they're getting like 1,000 to 10,000 beetles in their traps. So our numbers are still low, but they were building. And kind of causing a little concern for me. So next year we are going to be increasing our trapping efforts. So we usually trap in the spring. We set our traps in late April. We take them in late June to try to catch those spring flights of the beetle. But next year we are going to trap in the spring, but then again in the fall. So we'll trap from April through June, and then we'll trap again in late August to early October. Sometimes the beetles will disperse again in late fall, late summer, late fall, as they get ready for winter. To help us better monitor if we are seeing population increases, if we are seeing them spread to further areas, and if we do need action. So we did find for the first time an infested tree. So one of our sites in Mashpee, we found over 150 beetles in the trap. And we found 2 trees in close proximity to that trap that had southern pine beetle. So my forester that was out checking the trap, he's like, I think we have pitch tubes. I'm really nervous. So we saw these kind of gummy pitch tubes. We saw about 10 per tree in both of the trees. So we went up with we got a ladder, got a hammer and chisel, and sampled those pitch tubes to confirm that it was actually southern pine beetle. Luckily, the one I sampled had a southern pine beetle stuck in the pitch. And then when I brought it back to the microscope, we were able to correctly identify it as southern pine beetle. So this was the first time we've ever found it in a tree or actively attacking a tree in Massachusetts. Previously, the only detections had ever been in our traps in really low numbers. Part of this was we've had some mild winters. So 2021, 2022, pretty mild winters. Even this last year, our winter was pretty mild, except for one or two really cold snaps. But the insects are usually pretty hardy when they're inside the tree. The bark and the tree itself is protecting them from a lot of those winter temperatures. We've just had long falls, hot summers that have allowed the population to increase. So as I said before, down in the South where they have really common outbreaks all the time, they'll have 8 generations per year. Here in Massachusetts, if we have a resident population, it probably has 2 to 3 generations per year. And they estimated in Long Island when they got to that outbreak level for the first time in 2014 is when they pushed the threshold of having 4 generations per year. So here in Massachusetts, we know they're present from the way that we see them dispersed and the numbers we're kind of seeing. We have a low level resident population here. And if we do have the right conditions, we are at risk of having an outbreak and having possible tree mortality events. So in being prepared, other things we can kind of do is increase the resilience of our landscape. So a lot of our pitch pine stands have really been altered by human influence on our landscape, and they are not in kind of what would be a healthy kind of level. So they're really overstocked, super crowded, and sometimes you can do management thinning or silvicultural options to help increase the health of your stands a little bit. So the pictures on the right are from the Montague Plains up in Franklin County. And this is a fish and wildlife property, and they manage it for wildlife habitat. But the type of work they did there is actually really similar to what the type of thinning that gets done in the mid-Atlantic and South when they deal with some southern pine beetle stuff. So thinning it out, decreasing the basal area of your trees, allowing more airflow through your pitch pine. So the chemicals aren't as dense and you don't have beetles jumping as quickly from tree to tree. Also, when you have a little bit more space around your trees, it's a little less stressful for them. They can be a little bit healthier. Introducing more regular fire regimes on our landscapes and kind of timing those fires so that they are effectively controlling our forest management, but not getting too hot that they're damaging our trees. So these are just kind of some examples of pitch pine management in the Northeast. So it is something that people are doing, and that can be done to help increase kind of the resiliency of our forests. Out in Nantucket, you guys have some really cool pitch pine landscapes where it'll be open and then like a little clump of trees. So some of this isn't quite as relevant to your landscape out there, but there are some pockets that are just too dense or have like too much white pine mixed in and aren't quite as healthy as they can be. I've also seen a bunch of black pine planted out on Nantucket, and that can also be susceptible to southern pine beetle. It is not as common in our landscape here and not quite as preferred as pitch pine, but southern pine beetle are able to readily infest that. So while I have a captive audience, I do want to mention one more thing besides southern pine beetle, and that is beech leaf disease. So this is a newly identified disease, first found out in Ohio, and it has spread really, really rapidly. So it has quickly moved from Ohio out here. It took them a few years to figure out what was actually causing the disease. They found out that it was a foliar nematode, which is not something that usually impacts trees. So it's been a real mystery, and it is impacting Massachusetts at an alarming rate. So we first identified it in the state in 2020 in Plymouth. Since then, we found it in over 80 communities. We found it in every county. It is widespread and it is causing decline in our trees. So last year, I got a report from Nantucket in a residential area in some planted beech, but I haven't gotten a chance to get out to the island and take myself or anyone from my team since that report. But on these coastal and island forests, understory beech are really important, and they're really important to wildlife as well. So keep your eyes out for the disease when you're out and about. It's pretty easy to identify. So it causes this dark bands on the leaves. So between the veins, you'll just have these really dark green bands. And on a nice sunny day, if you're walking under the canopy of an infested tree and look up and they're backlit, you can it's really easy. They'll pop out really well. And as the disease kind of progresses, you'll see more and more striping on the leaves, and leaves will eventually come out like really withered and curled right after bud break. And they'll be like thick and almost like leathery. They don't feel like brittle at all, and they'll be really dark in color. And eventually, as the disease progresses, is more abundant throughout the canopy, as you get more and more nematodes, you'll have buds that just won't even be able to push out leaves anymore. You'll have leaves that are so damaged, they'll drop really early in the season. So you'll see in like the end of June, just like no leaves, or you'll see like these weird second flush of leaves that don't really look like beech leaves coming out. So we are seeing some sites already where we're seeing a lot of decline in beech, and I wouldn't be surprised if we did start to see mortality in some trees in the next couple of years, especially in the areas in Plymouth and Bristol counties that we first identified it in 2020. So keep your eyes out. It impacts American beech and European beech. It'll actually impact all of the cultivars of the European beech. So even the ones that have like the darker purplish leaves, they'll see it's a little bit harder to see on those, but you'll still see like a darker band on them as well. And our beech also have beech bark disease. It's actually not quite as common out on the islands and coastal areas, but it still is present and does cause a lot of stress to our beech trees. So it's introduced fungal pathogen so a scale insect will feed on the beech. That feeding damage will allow the fungus to get in, and then the fungus develops cankers. And over time, as you get more and more cankers, it'll eventually like girdle the tree and it won't be able to move nutrients effectively. So it's really common to see beech that have those white spots of the scale insects. Sometimes you'll see the red, orangish spots of the fungus spores, and then kind of these cankers that start out small, usually like around the size of like a quarter, but over time can really spread and become like huge, like 10 inches around. And something fun to end on is last year I got a lot of comments that people are like, oh, my tree is covered in insects, and like the floor underneath my tree is black. And it's from these beech blight aphids, which are a native insect and are usually not that harmful for trees, but like once in a while, they'll just be like a kind of bump in the population. And in late summer, early fall, you'll just see a huge number of them. They're also known as the boogie woogie aphids because they'll all just like be dancing around on the twigs. And they excrete honeydew, which is just kind of like very gross and very sugary. So when it lands on the forest floor underneath the trees, it'll allow sooty mold to grow on that honeydew. So you'll just see these guys dancing around, causing a mold party. So they're not that damaging to trees. They're just fun to watch. But here is my contact information and the mass.gov website for forest health and our story map. Also, if you ever forget, just Google DCR Forest Health, and on our website, it'll show right up, and I'll have all my contact information and contact information for some of my team. And we love to hear from people. We love to get reports. Some of the things that we look for, if you are taking a report, letting us know what kind of tree it is, what type of damage you're seeing. We love to have a picture included and the location where you're seeing it. So hopefully southern pine beetle levels will continue to stay low. My team will keep working on trapping, on doing our aerial surveys and other monitoring efforts to kind of capture things early. But it is great to have more eyes out there. And just the picture that's on the right now, that is a picture from 2018 or 2019 after the March storms we got that year. So you can kind of see like it totally browned out the canopy of these trees. So these our coastal pitch pines can be really stressed out by natural processes, natural things, but our changing climate and the increase of storm events, the increasing temperatures are putting them more at risk to infestations from things like southern pine beetle.
All right. Thank you, Nicole, so much. That's the one bad part about Zoom webinars is we can't all clap for you. So I'm like, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a lot of questions of things that I wrote down as you were talking, but I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please put it in the chat or the Q&A, whichever is comfortable to you. I'll read it out loud so it stays as part of the recording. And yeah. And also I just wanted to mention, Nicole, when you mentioned the story map, I pulled it up and I put it in the chat. So there's a direct link right there if anybody wants to look at it right away.
Great, thank you.
In the Zoom. So I really appreciate, first of all, that your discussion of how the trees are susceptible to a lot of things right now, right? So while southern pine beetle is something that we're really focused on, it's like there's so many different stressors on these trees. So whatever we can do to help minimize that impact. I know you talked a lot about, some of the ways that we can like thin the forest, kind of help for that health of the forest. I've seen kind of different discussions about density. So when you say, what's too dense for a stand, I know it has to do with the DBH, or like the width of the tree. But what's too dense for your mind, or what's our goal?
It is hard to say, and there are like different views on it. So we're kind of lucky that we've seen kind of what's happened in Long Island and what's been successful for them, because southern pine beetle does behave differently in pitch pine stands compared to like the longleaf and yellow pines and stuff of the South. And I don't know. So it is in like, so most of the time they measure it in like basal area, which is like the diameter of your tree and then how many trees you have in an acre. So you want to reduce down to it. And there's been some good papers that have come out of Long Island, and I can't think off the top of my head the name of it. But there's research out there that kind of gives you some of these target numbers based on it. But like the picture that I'm showing right now, like that is probably too dense of a stand. And some of the issues we have now are just that we have had kind of not management. We've had not a lot of disturbance in our trees, and it's normal for trees to die. Not every tree is going to make it to be that beautiful big old tree. And you want a diverse landscape that has some old big trees and some young trees. But our forests were so clear cut not that long ago, so a lot of our trees are really similar in age, and they've kind of all just grown together and are really dense right now. So getting a mix and kind of incorporating some of that diversity and giving the forest kind of a little bit of a hand to get to that point.
Thanks for that. Guthrie is asking, what outreach strategies did you find most effective in helping the public understand proactive forest management? So I think as we at Nantucket are kind of getting ready to do some proactive forest management, what have you found to be useful?
I mean, it's been really nice having opportunities like this for webinars and like reaching bigger audiences, but I usually find the most impactful ones when we actually get to go out and like walk through a forest and kind of show examples. And I think people just don't always realize what has been managed and what hasn't. So sometimes when you bring people through a stand that was managed 10 years ago, they are really surprised at like how healthy and how good it looks, and how I think they expect it to be like, I think they think cuts are always just a clear cut where it looks like a barren, sad landscape. So I really enjoy getting to be out in the forest and kind of doing some walk and talks. But I like getting to share on webinars and other platforms to show some of this information. There is somewhat of a bias effect because sometimes people that are joining these sorts of talks and groups are already on board with these ideas, and it can be challenging to spread it to lots of different groups. So I just always talk to anyone. We chat when we're out in the forest and see people hiking when we're doing work, like we'll just start talking and telling people what we're doing too, just to share.
That's very helpful information. Because we are Nantucket based, I did want to mention to people who may be considering pine management is that on Nantucket specifically, we know that the northern long-eared bat uses pitch pine for roost trees. And so there's a moratorium on cutting trees at certain times of the year. And so just be mindful of that. I don't know if that's a statewide thing, or I know it's specifically to Nantucket because of the bats. Northern long-eared bats are now federally endangered. So for the audience members. And so, you know, here at Linda Loring, we're doing pine management on Japanese black pine right now in the winter time. And, you know, do you have any thoughts too about like time of year that's beneficial for thinning, or it's kind of like whenever you can get crews out?
It is usually most not it's usually the best to do it in winter, just because you're not, so when you're cutting trees, they're getting stressed, they're releasing those chemicals. So if you do have like a population nearby and you are releasing all of these chemicals, it can actually be attractive to beetles and kind of pull them in. And sometimes just getting equipment in can be a little stressful to trees. So sometimes when the ground's harder in the winter, it's less impactful to roots. But sometimes you can't always get that timing right, or you have things like the endangered species that are kind of limiting that. So avoiding those like more stressful times, like if you're having a crazy drought in the summer, like don't go in when your trees are already so stressed out. Like avoiding impacting trees more than necessary. So trying to time it in those windows where your trees can have a little bit of a recovery and time to go through that process.
I thought all my questions were going to be about southern pine beetle, and then you mentioned the beech leaf disease, which gave me like another anxiety attack. We love our beech trees here on Nantucket, and so what I was, you know, watching your section on how to identify the nematodes, but do you have any thoughts for prevention? So if we had someone who had some, you said on Nantucket that was from a obviously planted tree, how do we, are there prevention measures that we can do, or is it just looking for the infestation? And then what if we found a tree that was infested, aside from, of course, alerting you guys, what would be the next step?
So since it is a nematode, which is like, so we're starting from scratch on it because it's not like a bark beetle. Like we know how bark beetles work, like they're a common thing, but a nematode as a pathogen in a tree is like unheard of. So we don't really know exactly how it's spreading. We don't know how it spreads to new areas, how it spreads within a tree itself or to neighboring trees, but it does seem likely that it's probably birds, just because of the huge distances we're seeing it spread within a year. Like sometimes we'll be at a campsite looking through, don't see anything on the beach, and campsites are usually high risk because you have people coming from out of state bringing wood and stuff in, and then we'll hike 2 miles into the woods, we'll be out not near any roads, and we'll find an infested tree. So it does seem likely that human assisted movement is not the primary driver, and if it's moving by birds, there's not much we can do to slow that down because, as I said, beech are really big for our wildlife. They're a very incredibly useful tree. So they get a lot of like birds feeding on the buds. The buds are where the nematodes are over winter. So it's probably that they're feeding on the buds, feeding on the early leaves, flying to a new tree, pooping those nematodes out. So we actually don't have any best management practices or options for reducing spread at this point. It's just monitoring and identifying.
All right, well, we will help spread the word about what to look for so that we can, you know, alert you. So we can at least provide information, if we see anything, but hopefully we won't, I guess. Is the big
Hopefully not.
Hopefully
We don't know how quickly it progresses. It's there's so much we don't know, and there's not any good treatment options at this point either. Some people have been trying like polyphosphate root drenches, but it's not been proven at scale that it is an effective treatment.
All right, well, does anyone else have any questions before we go today? Or Nicole, is there anything else that you want to mention before we finish out?
The other big thing you guys have been experiencing on Nantucket has been a fall cankerworm outbreak. So in the interior oak scrub area, and that's another one that's just, it's a native insect. It's native to our forest. It evolved here with our trees, but sometimes something just kind of gets out of cycle and we have a huge population increase. So we've been seeing for the past 4 years a lot of defoliation out there from this native insect. and it's been decreasing last year. So hopefully we don't see a lot this year. But for those of you that have been out and are like, what's going on in the spring to these trees? It's been just another native insect, and it's probably climate change that's been driving some of these changes that we see in our forest pests.
Well, thank you. I do want to mention for our audience too that there's, I got connected with Nicole through Danielle Odell from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. Between Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Nantucket Land Bank, Mass Audubon, us at Linda Loring, and other groups, we're all, kind of aware of southern pine beetle. We're doing some monitoring. So you might be seeing us out in the forest this summer, looking up, looking down, measuring trees. So, just like Nicole was saying, monitoring and keeping an eye out are kind of the first steps. And so we're starting on this, and this is part of having Nicole here, is that to help us learn more about this as land managers, but also to help spread the news to the public. So there is forward movement for Nantucket people. I don't want to end on we're seeing all these bats and we're not doing anything about it. There are actions being taken. So I want to thank you, Nicole, so much for being here today. And for everyone else online, we're have this recording. We'll be sending the recording out to everyone who registered. And then a little bit later, it'll be fully available on our website. And so if you want to share, you're welcome to share this information with anyone else that that might be interested in southern pine beetle, in beech leaf disease, and some of the work being done. So thanks again, Nicole, so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for asking me to join.
Great.